Hey guys, welcome to the Arrays 2 lecture. Happy St. Patrick's Day, everyone, as well. I hope everyone is safe during these crazy times. So, I'm just going to review the problems from the last lecture and feel free to ask any questions or chime in with your own implementation. This is just one way to solve these problems, but there's definitely multiple ways as well. Arrays are a very important data structure that everyone should be very familiar with and very comfortable working with. They come up all the time when we're building web applications and when we're trying to accomplish certain tasks. Arrays are a very commonly used tool to solve specific tasks. So without further ado, we'll go and tackle this first problem of my includes. So basically, this is a common operation that a lot of websites will need to have. Basically, just checking if something is in a list, basically. And so if something is in that list, then we want to return true. And if it's missing in the list, then we want to return false. So let's get started. First, I'm just going to write some pseudocode. So first, I want to go through each element in the array.
If you were saying that in order to do that, I would have to get a new prescription for it.
If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask them. But if you guys don't have any questions, if you guys can mute yourselves, I'll mute everyone for now. But yeah, feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions aloud or say it in the chat. So I'm going to go through each element, and if that element matches the second argument, I'm going to just return true. I don't even need to break here. I can just return true. And then at the end of the loop, I'll just return false since this condition was never met. So I know that I never found my element. So we'll try this out. So we'll have an array and we'll have a target. And so I'll just loop through. r.length I++. And then here I'll just say let element equals array at I. So I don't have to do this, but sometimes I like to work with variables as opposed to constantly having to access this index of an array. So I could just say, does anyone want to offer me some help here in what I should do in my conditional? Any takers? Awesome. See some things popping out in the chat. So yeah, element equals target. Perfect. So everyone can see that. Thank you guys for giving me some guidance here. So yeah, we'll just check, is the element equal to the target? And if so, then we can just return true. And then I don't really need to do anything else, which is nice because it'll keep checking this condition for this every single element in this entire array. And then at the end, what should I return when I get to the end of this function? Yep, just return false because we know that we've checked every single element because we went through all the way to the end of the array.length. So yeah, this is a very commonly done operation. And so later on, we'll even learn there's a shortcut so that you don't really have to type this out because this is so commonly done that JavaScript has a method that's basically built into the language that allows for functionality like this. But yeah, again, it's very commonly used. But under the hood, even though you may not type this out all the time in your actual code because you might just use the JavaScript shortcut method, it's still good to know that this is sort of how it works under the hood and how it's implemented. So yeah, that's my includes. I think the other one was my last index of. So yeah, index of, it wants 3 arguments. There's an optional argument here. So the now we'll handle optional arguments and see what the best way to handle that is. So the simplest case is when, so we want to see the last index at which a search value appears. So when they say last, that, at least to me, I think of starting at the end because you could either start at the beginning or start at the end. And whether or not you choose to decide which way to start, it'll make the problem a little bit easier or a little bit harder. And so whenever you're dealing with arrays and finding things in arrays, you should always try and think, should I start at the end? That should always be something that you also consider because sometimes you just automatically assume, okay, I gotta start at the beginning. You get into this rhythm of, okay, I start my thing at 0 and then I end at the length, and it becomes almost like muscle memory. But then you should also start thinking, should I start at the end and go towards the beginning? That should also be consideration. And it's good to get into the habit of thinking like that because that could make the problem a lot easier. So I'm thinking if they want the last index, not the first index, maybe I'll start at the end and then keep going until I reach my target. So in this case, if it's optional, I guess they're not passing it in, then we are starting at the end and we're just going until we hit this. And so that'll be the 0, 1, 2, third index. If it's not in the array, then we return -1. So here we could start at the end, go all the way through, and there's no Jessica in this list, so we return -1. And in this case, they actually pass in 2. So we should start looking. So it's saying if starting index is defined, we should start looking for the search value at that index and then move towards the front of the array. Okay, so yeah, we start at 0, 1, 2. So we'll start here and then we'll move towards the start of the array. So basically there's 2 choices. There's we start at the end when there's nothing inputted, or we start at whatever's inputted. So there's kind of a conditional here. So this is a good time for some pseudocode. So let's say create a variable that will be where we start iterating. And so it'll just, when there's a conditional, sometimes it's simple to just create that variable and don't even assign it. Just create it, and then we'll have a conditional after to actually assign it. So we'll say if start index exists, then so this variable could be called like start or something. If start index exists, then start will be start index. If start index does not exist, then start will be, what will start be if it doesn't exist? If they don't pass any argument, then what should our start index be? Yeah, perfect. So length minus 1. And here we'll say go iterate from start till, I guess this isn't the best word, end, because we're kind of going from the end. So iterate from end to start and try and find the target. If we find the target, return the index. At the end, return -1 if we haven't found it. So this one is definitely a little trickier than the last one. There's a little bit more involved, but I think the main idea here is when there's there's multiple different possibilities for a variable, then it's good to just create that variable and then set it later, assign it with some conditionals, and then figure out what that variable is going to be by assigning it at a later time. And another main big idea is when we have anything related to arrays, we shouldn't think of always starting from the beginning. I mean, that's at least how I thought in the beginning. I was always like, let me just go from the start. It was almost like habit, but we should always be aware that starting from the end is perfectly valid too. So we have this function last index of, and it'll take a array, a search value, and a start index, and that's optional. And so I could just say let end equals, or I could just say let end, and that's it. Just create that, and I don't know what it's going to be yet because it could be multiple different things. So how can I check if this is passed in or not? Like how can, like if I do my last index of like 1, 2, 3, and 1, how do I know if this has been, this start index has been passed in, this third argument? Any guesses? So yeah, if it's not undefined. So basically, exactly. So if nothing gets passed in here, as I mentioned before, start index, having that as a parameter, as I mentioned in the scope lecture, it's basically under the hood, it's saying let's start index. So once we actually pass in a start index, so let's say we pass in like 3, then start index will be assigned to 3. But if we never pass anything in to this, then it's just going to stay as let's start index. So let's start index is just going to be undefined, because if you declare a variable and you don't assign to it, then it's undefined by default. So here we could say let end, and we could say if start index truthy or falsy, because undefined will become falsy. So if there is a start index, then we could assign end to the start index, else end will be the array.length -1, like the last index of the array. So you could have done it the opposite way. So you could have said if start index is undefined, which means it's falsy. If the fact that it's falsy is true, then we just reverse it, and then this is start index. Either way works. And so yeah, now end is never going to be undefined, because we always assign it. If it goes into this conditional, then we assign it to this value. Else, we assign it to this value. So it'll always be assigned in this case. So it'll always have a value. So now we can just use it. And then where should I start this for loop? Do I have any volunteers? Should I start at 0? Should I start it at... Yeah, basically end. Start it at end. It could be length minus 1, but we wouldn't want to start at length minus 1 if we are given a start index. If we're given a start index, then we want to start there. Just as this example here, the and 2, I believe they're starting at 0, 1, 2. I believe they're starting... Wait. Maybe I have this a little mixed up. If start index is defined, it should start looking at that index. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, return 0. So it starts looking here, and then it goes down, and then it finds 0. So yeah, we start at the end. It's a little different this time, but while I is greater than or equal to 0, and then I minus minus. So now we'll have element to be array at I, and then we'll say if element equals search value. What should we return in this case? Last time we were returning just true, but in this case, what do we want to return if we find that element? Yep, index. And then at the end, we'll just return -1 since we haven't found it. And yeah, this should work. So yeah, that sort of again, the big takeaways are try things from the end if starting from or always consider being able to start from the end. And if there's 2 possibilities, you could do something like this where you don't assign it until later. And there's like a shortcut way to do this without this much code. So in JavaScript, you could actually do something like let end, or we could just use a const in this case because we don't want it to change. We could do const end equals, and then we could basically do like a ternary, it's what it's called. So basically we could say if start index question mark, if that's truthy, then end is going to be start index. Or wait, we could just use an or here, actually. We could say end equals start index or array.length -1. Let's keep it a lot shorter here. I think that still works. Because basically the or, I know we learned about Booleans last time. So we have like, if something is false or true, it evaluates to true, I believe. Let me just do a quick check. Yeah, it evaluates true. So if you have a bunch of falsy things like false or 0 or undefined or 1, then it's always gonna choose the truthy one. So we could just use that logic to say, oh, if start index is truthy, then use it. It's not going to evaluate further. If it's truthy, then it's just going to stop there, and that's what's going to be assigned to end. But if it's falsy, then keep going. And this is always going to be truthy because this is never going to be 0 unless the array is length of 1. Wait, let me see how that works. So if the array was length of 1 and that was 0 and that became falsy, then if you have undefined or 0, yeah, I think it takes the last one anyways. Even though 0 is falsy, it'll just take the last one if it's the last member in that expression. So yeah, just another way to assign. But using the if is completely fine too. And the last question is my reverse. I believe, was it? Yeah, my reverse. Okay, so here we just want to reverse an array. So one thing we could do is, as before, we could just start at the end of the array. Actually, first we will probably want to create. We want to create a array, an empty array, and then start at the end of the given array, and then push elements in from end to start. So yeah, we have function myReverse takes in an array, and then we want to basically can have a array like reversed, set that, and then where should I start this loop? Is there anyone that can help me out figure out where I should start my iteration in order to get the reversed? Yep, array.length -1, and then I is greater than or equal to 0, and then I minus minus. And now this is going to be my element. And then we just push that in. And then we just return reversed. Yeah, that's one way to reverse it. There's other ways too. We could have popped from the original array and then taken that and then pushed it into this new array. But I think this is a clear way to reverse an array. So yeah, are there any other questions about the problems from the last lecture? If not, then we'll continue on with the array methods that we have to learn for arrays 2. So some more methods. And to be completely honest, working with arrays, practicing a lot with arrays, I think is really helpful. But for certain methods, like you could always look them up and how they work. So I wouldn't say it's really, really important that you memorize how splice works, for example, because you would always be able to, in some interview or something, like look up these methods. Obviously, I think you should memorize push and pop. I think you should memorize certain ones like concat is pretty important actually, and you guys will learn other more complicated methods that I think are really important. But splice, there's a lot of different arguments and different optional arguments, and just memorizing everything to exact T. I mean, it's definitely could be helpful, but I would say practicing with nested arrays and just doing problems with, picking certain items that you like in an array from an array, and like filtering arrays and reversing those, practicing those kinds of problems is going to be a lot more helpful than like memorizing the function signature of splice and things like that. But I mean, splice can do a lot, and there's definitely some important concepts here, like mutability and immutability, that will come into play. So we'll go over those, but I wouldn't stress out about memorizing these exactly, because I still didn't even know it, and I had to look it up. So as long as you know how to look things up, I think it's good. But yeah, it mutates the original array, which basically means That's why I tend to use it very little, very infrequently, because it changes the original array, and sometimes that's that's gonna cause confusing behavior. Like for example, let's say some or I'll do some code examples in a bit, but in this case, basically it takes the first argument is the index and the second argument is how many to delete. So it returns a new array with all the removed elements. So does anyone want to guess what this will log when we console log names? John. So I believe that's what single term presidents will be, but names is going to be, yeah, it's going to be George and Thomas because that's the original array. And then single term names, I believe, is going to be John. Yeah, so good guess. But yeah, it's George and Thomas for those of you that answered. That is because the original array gets changed when you do something like this. And that's why I kind of don't use it a lot because when someone sets let names equals to this array and then you change that, that's kind of confusing, and downstream that could lead to some code that's breaking because it expects names to be this array. Like if you expect names to be this array, that's what you're setting it as. So why would you believe otherwise that names has changed? But now you've spliced and then now you've changed it. That's pretty confusing in my opinion. And you can't really bank on, or you can't rely on this array being what it's set as, what it's assigned as. And so personally, I think that's kind of confusing. But it's if you're doing this all within your own local function that you created and names is just something that you're using and nobody else is relying on it, then it doesn't really matter. All this mutability stuff only matters if somebody else is using that in that same scope. So if this is all wrapped up in a function that only you are using and no one else is using, then not as big of a deal. So yeah, in this case, we have 1 and 2. So are there any guesses what names? Oh, okay. But yeah, it basically cuts off 2 names. So it'll cut off John and Ringo, and that'll be what across the universe, or Paul and George. I think this is backwards actually, because Paul and Ringo. Oh no, it's right, it's right. So it starts at 1. And it gets rid of 2. Yeah, this might be wrong. But anywho, let's try it out. Because I think it should be if it starts here and then it removes 2. I feel like names should be Paul and George, and across the universe should be John and Ringo. But yeah, we can try it. And I'll also go into a quick example of what I mean by immutability. And it doesn't really matter if it's all local to your own function, but let's say you have an argument that's passed into your function, then it might matter. So we have this. Paul and Ringo, George and John. Yeah, I thought it, so 1. Oh, I guess it starts here. It doesn't, I thought it started after and then it removed next 2, but I guess it starts here and then it removes from that actual index. So yeah, it'll remove these 2. Yeah, that makes total sense. So yeah, it was right. As you can tell, I'm not very well versed in this method. But basically, an example I could give is like, let's say you had a function that, you wanted to uh, get the last three elements. It's super contrived, but of array. And then you get passed in an array. And then let's say it does like return array dot splice, and you want the last three. So um, let's say if you wanted the last three, then well, I guess I wouldn't really know where to start based on how it. So let's just say it just gets subset of array, and then yeah, 1 and 3, but then like if we did 1 and 3, so some people are suggesting 1 and 3 or 1 in array.length 3, but then that would mean we're starting at 1. That wouldn't really mean we're getting the last three, but that's kind of beside the point. Basically, this is just gonna get like some piece of the array, but if we start the array to be, if we like declare it outside of the function, and then we call it, and then we call the function, we call get subset of array on names, and then we say const subset equals that, then we changed names too, which is kind of confusing to whoever uses names. So that's why using splice might cause some unintended behavior for things that are even outside of the scope of your function. So I think, let me just console log names. And thanks for all the help, guys. Yeah, array length 4, 3. I'm sure those work. So let's do subset. Let me just get rid of this. Names is not defined. Yeah, so if you look here, like, it's pretty confusing. Like, after I call this function, like, the rest of the code probably will still think that this array will look like this. Just because you called this function, you can't really, it's not intuitive that this actual array actually changed. So yeah, this is, if you kept everything within the scope of this function, like if this function just didn't even take a parameter, and then you were just doing like let array equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 4, 5, and then you just did return array dot splice, then that means that like it doesn't really matter. In this case, you can mutate all you want, and no outside code is going to really care because it's just your own function. Nothing else that anybody else will touch. You're not going to confuse anyone basically because you're only working within the local scope of this locally scoped function. But once you start taking in parameters from the outside and then start mutating that inside the function, then things get confusing for other people working in the code base when they read this declaration and they just assume, I would just assume that this array is always going to look like this if I get to use it outside of my own local scope. But it changed, so sometimes that can lead to confusing behavior. Just a small aside about splice and how it mutates the original array. So you could do this with, you could get a subset of the array. You could do this exact same thing without using splice, and we'll learn it um, in later on in this lecture. And I would probably recommend to use that. But you can still use splice all the time. Splice is definitely useful. It can do a lot, but I would say just in that case, maybe try and work with a local variable. So how you might do that is like if you take in an array, you could say let new array equals um, array dot slice. We'll learn about slice later, and basically this copies the array. So when you do new array dot splice, then you're not actually changing the actual array, but we'll learn about slice later on in the lecture. But this is something I would rather do in order to not to change the outside array's value. So yeah, back to splice. First argument is the index you start at, and then the next argument is how many you want to remove. You can also add new elements. So in this case, you splice at 2, so you remove Pete, but then you add Ringo. So yeah, Pete gets removed, and then the original array removes Pete, but it added Ringo in his place. So yeah, you can also just replace. So how else could you do this in a simple way is you could also just access that array at the index of 2 and then just set it to Ringo. But you could also use splice as well. Unless we want to, so Raymond says, unless we want to change the original array, the use case is theater seat assignment. Yeah, sometimes you want to change the original array. There's definitely a use case. In programming, you never want to say you'll never use this or this is always bad, because there's always going to be a case where it actually is useful. So there are definitely cases where you want to change the original. So you don't have to remove any elements. So in this case, this kind of just like functions as like a push. But you can push in a specific index, which is nice. So push only adds to the end. But here you're adding Pete and Stewart 0, 1, 2 in between Ringo and John, I believe. So yeah, you're adding Pete and Stewart. Oh, in between George and John. So I guess it adds. So I guess it starts removing. That's kind of confusing that it starts removing at that index, but in terms of adding, it adds Ringo, John. It adds kind of before that index. So it removes at the index and it adds before that index of the first argument. So yeah, join is also important. I always forget this one too, but I think it would be helpful to definitely commit this to memory, because this kind of thing happens a lot where essentially you want to turn an array into a string. So if you do join string names.join, it just concatenates all the elements into a string. So it becomes a string, and then it just mashes all of the elements together. I believe the default separator element is a comma if you don't put anything into join. But as we'll see in the next slide, if we pass an argument into the join, then that is what gets used to be in between all the elements of the array. So if we wanted to make a character or a string that makes a little more sense, then we could use a we could pass in an argument and then it injects it in between each name. Concat is, I use this a lot because it doesn't change the array on which it was called. So it's an immutable method because it doesn't mutate the array, or it doesn't mutate anything. It just merges one array into the other, but the original array is untouched. And I really like these methods because these are, I feel like they don't cause any confusing side effects. So when we mash them together, older.concat younger, it'll just create one array that has all of these elements together in them. And older is still the same. So no surprises, no weird behaviors where, you're assigning to an array and then that assignment gets changed or that value gets changed right under your nose. It all just reads how it all is, just the way it's written is how it actually is. So yeah, concat, just concatenating two arrays. Nested arrays. Now this is something that I feel like is a common question. It comes up, this concept of manipulating nested arrays comes up quite often in interviews and things of that nature. So it's good to get experience with nested arrays. So we know how to get the element of a regular array, and for nested arrays, it's pretty much the same thing, but instead of the element being a string or a primitive value like a number, string, boolean, it'll just be a array or an object, but in this case it's an array. So related thing 0, it'll be an array, another array, and so in order to access the actual property, you need to access that index again. So you would need to do 2 square brackets in order to get the actual string value of Windows. Like so. Any guesses as to what these 2 logs would print to the console? Windows, Mac OS, yep, that's the first thing. It would be an array of Windows, Mac OS, and the second thing would be New York. Yep. So yeah, you can, and this is infinitely, it can be infinite, meaning that an array could have another array that could also have another array that could also have another array, and this could just go on forever and ever. Theoretically. What would be the length of related things? Yep, just 2 elements. And each of those elements also has a length. That would be 2. So yeah, does anyone want to guess how we could basically access each string in this it's a challenging question, but essentially you would have to loop through the array and then check if that element is an array, and then if it is, then loop through that array. So this is where we'll figure out about nested loops. So in this case where there's only 2 levels, so there can only be a nested array. That array can't also have another nested array. But here, we're getting the element and we're setting it to be that index, and then we're checking, we're asking that element, are you also an array? If it is, then we'll loop again. through that element, and then we'll get the actual name and we'll log it. Else, we'll just log it because if it's not an array, then we'll assume that it's a string in this case, and we'll just be able to log that. So this is an introduction to nested for loops, and which is basically a loop within a loop. And that's also a very important topic that I feel like you guys will benefit from practicing a lot, is basically working with these nested loops and just thinking in your head what exactly is happening when we iterate through nested arrays, and when we use nested for loops, because it's a lot to keep in your head. There's a lot of different variables and there's a lot of bookkeeping that has to be done, but it's definitely useful, and we'll find out how it's useful. But yeah, this is sort of how we would access nested properties of arrays. But this only works if it's one level deep. So if that first nested array also had a nested array. So if Mel was inside of an array, then this wouldn't really work because it only really goes one level in. But for this example, it works. So nested arrays so we might ask, what's the point of nested arrays? Like, this just seems complicated, overly complicated. Like, and I agree, like I wouldn't want to ever create a nested array unless I absolutely had to, because it is kind of confusing. Like, just use an array and keep things all as simple as possible is, I believe, a good way to code. But sometimes you actually have to use a nested array, and it actually has a good use case, which is to represent a sheet or a two-dimensional structure, such as something that has a x-axis and a y-axis. Or if we think about Microsoft Excel, like a grid. If we think about Excel, like a cell, or Excel can be basically represented in a two-dimensional array where each array is like a row, and each it's basically like rows and columns where you could access each cell using a row ID and a column index. A nested array could be used to represent that grid like structure. So yeah, the first column we could get by obtaining the grid at 0, 0, 1, 0, and 2, 0. So the first column is just 1, 1, 1. If we look here, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but wait, actually, where's my mouse? I guess this is full screen, but 1, 1, 1, that's one column, and then 2, 2, 2 is another column, and 3, 3, 3 is another column. This whole thing is a row. So you could think of it like a Google Sheets, where this is one cell, this is another cell, this is another cell, and then these are all cells. And this is a column, this is a row. And the address of each cell is the index, sort of like this is like your Y index and this is your X index. So your Y is 0, like starts here, and then your X is 0 as well. Your Y becomes 1, so your Y-axis, you go to the first index, and then the X-axis stays the same, and then so on and so forth. So yeah, we can go over some examples of nested arrays. I guess did you guys learn slice already? I guess you guys might have already learned slice. I thought it would be in this lecture, but yeah, it basically just, you can make a copy, but you can also get a subset of an array as well. But if you don't pass anything in, then it just makes a copy of the entire array. So yeah, we can work through nested for loops. So an example might be of a net. I'll just go over some practice for nested for loops. So let's say you wanted to log out all the months in all the dates in a year. So you wanted to log out 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, 1-4, and then so on until February. And then you go 2-1, 2-2, 2-3, and then all the way until March, 3-1, and then all the way until December, 12-31. Then how would you accomplish this task? A way to do this is to use a nested for loop. And this is, I think, a good way, at least for me, to visualize what a nested for loop is doing. So we could have, so we could represent the month as the outer for loop. So we could start the month at 1, go until it's 12, and then add. And then inside this inner for loop, it could be the day. And then while day is less than or equal to 31, day plus plus. And here we could just log month and then day. Yeah. Whoa. I think this is not liking that syntax. Yeah, I'm not sure why this isn't running. Okay. So yeah, this is an example of a nested for loop, and basically you have your inside here, your month is going to be 1 initially. So first month is going to be 1 in here. So we know month is going to be 1. And then it's going to go into this for loop. And then month is still 1. Nothing's changed. But now day is 1. And then it logs 1, 1, 1, 1. And then we can't exit this for loop until we're done with the for loop. So we can't proceed with the outer for loop until we're done with the inner for loop. So day becomes 1. And then day will become 2 and 3 and 4 and 5, and month will never be able to change. Month will always stay 1 until this inner for loop is done running. And then once we get to day 31, so once we get to 1-31, then this inner for loop is done. So now we can go to the outer for loop. We can leave this and go into the outer for loop. And the outer for loop's not done yet either. It's not off the hook. It has to go to 2. And then we just start all over. So that's, I think, an example of a use case for a nested for loop. And so we could apply this to that grid that we were shown earlier, where basically we have, we could say like this is like an Excel sheet. And it's just an Excel sheet of, let's say, each cell is just a, let's try to make it look kind of, so this could be the first row. So this would be like your column. So let's say, we had a spreadsheet of like users or something, and then this was like first name, these are just the columns, last name, birthday. That's the first row, and then these are like values now. So we have David Co, and then my birthday is 1/29/93, and then we have somebody else. So we could have Jackie, and then I'm not sure what your last name is, but we'll just say it's Jackie Johnson or something, and then just say you have the same birthday as me, and then we could have Levine. Yeah, cool. So we'll fix that up. And then the next person could be Winston Chan, and we just all have the same birthday. And we'll one more, Jessica Katrina. So this is an Excel sheet, and we're just representing it. It's like an abstraction of an Excel sheet. We're just representing it like this, like a nested array. And basically, these are our columns. So column 1 is first name column, and it's all our first names. Column 2, all of our last names. Column 3 is all of our birthdays. This is like a beautiful Excel sheet. And how we could iterate through all of those values is we could use a nested for loop, much the same way. So here we could just say, instead of month, this would be like our X, our row index, because we go row by row. And then within each row, we want to iterate through all the columns. So row index starts at 0, while row index is less than row or Excel sheet dot length, and then row index plus plus, and then here, what would this be inside? Inside this for loop, what we have our row index. Like, what else do we need in order to access each cell? Any guesses? Column, yeah, call index. We also start this at 0, and then we also go until call index is less than. And in this case, it's a little tricky because technically we can't use Excel sheet.length because that's how many rows are in this. Because each of these nested arrays represents a row. But we can't use Excel sheet.length. But what do you think we could use? Like, how do we figure out what the length of the how do we figure out, or actually, how many rows that is? Yeah, how long the columns are. So what's the length of the column? Like, how do we figure that out? Are there any guesses? That's a good guess. But the length of the Excel sheet is how many rows there are. So the length of the Excel sheet here is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there's 5 rows in this Excel sheet. But how do we figure out how many columns there are? Because we don't want to go there's no guarantee that the number of rows is going to be the number of columns. The length of an element, exactly. That's a really great answer. It's basically Excel sheet at row index dot length, and that gives you the length of this element, and then it also gives you the length of this element, and it also gives you the length of this element and this element and this element. So, and then here we do call index plus plus, and now inside here we have row index and we have call index, and that's all we need to access the cell, the specific cell of the Excel sheet. So let's say I want to like change my Excel sheet. So how do I get the cell value? Like, basically, this will iterate through every single cell, but how do I get the cell value? With, in this scope, I have a row index and a call index. So how would I get the value of the cell? Any guesses? Yep, exactly. Row, Excel sheet, row index, call index. Now I have my value. And then I could do something like, if cell value equals Winston, I want to like change your, I could like mutate your cell, like update your cell. So I could say, I'll update your name, and then I'll just say, let's see. Let's say your name was misspelled, like it was just Win. And then I could just then I could just update your name to be Winston or something. And then it should have updated it. What's going on here? Let me clear this out. There it is. So we started off with the Excel sheet being Win, and then we said, if the cell value is Win, then change that to Winston, and now we have Winston. So yeah, that's sort of an example of a useful case of using a nested for loop. If the birthday cell was undefined, then do something. Yeah. So George asked, if the birthday cell is undefined, then you want to add it. Exactly, that'd be perfect. So if this was just, if we unfortunately didn't have, if we didn't have the value though, we wouldn't be able to. It would have to be something like actually like undefined or something. If it was just empty, then it would never get there because we're only telling it to iterate the length of that array. But we could say, if the cell value, so it'd be like if call index equals 2, which means we're on the birthday section. So when the column index is 2, we're on the birthday column, and cell value equals undefined, then do like a default birthday of like 1 1 0 0 or something. We need to do this because otherwise we don't know if it's the birthday column. So in this case, it should change my birthday to be the default birthday. I don't know why this is all like messed up right now. Yeah. 1 1 0 0. So yeah, you could do a lot of stuff with this, but I think the important, like nested for loops are going to be used all the time. And you're going to encounter this very frequently, and it's very commonly like a interviewing question. And so I would definitely practice this a lot and just conceptually to understand what's going on. So like conceptually, like this just means that the row index is going to be 0 here. And then in here, it's also going to be 0 because it's just this it has access to the outer scope. Like just because you're in this scope doesn't mean you don't have access to this. You definitely do, because everything on the outside you have access to when you're nested deep inside. And so here you have row index is 0, and then call index is also 0, and you won't go to the next row index until you're done with the entire row. So until you've iterated through all the columns. So it'll go from 0 to 2, and then it'll break out, and then row index will be 1, and then in here row index will also be 1, and then we're going to go through all the columns from 0 to 2, and so on. So it's sort of like birthdays. It's sort of like not birthdays, but it's sort of like logging every single day of the year. Just that kind of concept of having some repeated work being done for each level. So in this case, it's basically we do repeat work for each row. But in the previous example, it was basically repeat work for each month. So for each month, we log all the days. For each row, we log all the columns. But it's like that kind of concept of just repeating a command, like you're repeating this for all of these elements on the outside. Sure, yeah, I could definitely share this in Slack. Do that right now. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this lecture, I believe. Yeah, nested arrays, and then we review. Oh yeah, there's a Sudoku project. It's definitely challenging, but I would give it a shot. I think it's very good practice for working with these like two-dimensional structures, because Sudoku is the same thing. It's just a Microsoft Excel sheet basically with a bunch of columns and a bunch of rows, and you have to kind of manipulate it and do a bunch of logic in each row and column. But I would try this out. And yeah, George said this stuff confuses me the most. It confuses me the most too, which is why I tried to practice it a lot, just because it's hard for me to visualize it just in my head all the time. But the more practice you'll get more comfortable with nested for loops, and that's going to help you out in the long run. So more than just like memorizing like splice signature, which you could always just look up online and figure it out as you go. I think these things are more useful, a better use of time. But yeah, definitely just whatever splice can do, I feel like you can do without splice. So if you could just, figure out if I only wanted George, or if I only wanted John and Thomas, like how you could do that under the hood, sort of how splice works under the hood, then that would be very helpful too, to practice things like that. Because whatever splice can do, it's definitely useful, and it's definitely, you're always going to be manipulating arrays. But you could also practice doing it without using splice. But yeah, you're going to always be changing arrays and shifting things around within arrays. So practicing that is always going to be helpful. So yeah, are there any questions? And if this still confuses you guys, definitely don't worry. It's something that you're not expected to understand right away. If it's easy for you, then that's good as well. But if it's challenging, it'll just definitely come with practice. And feel free to reach out if you're stuck on trying to wrap your head around this kind of stuff. So yeah, you guys did awesome for bearing with me during that lecture. But the lecture is over now. So you guys can take a little break